Welcome to Crooked. This time around, I'm making a coffee table out of this piece of walnut, this surprisingly pricey piece of walnut plywood. Then I'm going to paint it. This is a Cosmonaut coffee table. It's an idea I've had banging around in my head for years now. I'm a big fan of mid-century modern furniture. I'm also a big fan of science fiction pulp art. This piece gives me a chance to build a functional piece of furniture, and at the same time I get to incorporate one of my paintings into the piece. I don't know if you've seen the price of walnut plywood recently, but it's not cheap, and so I'm not taking any chances. I'm going to tape this plywood before I actually cut it to reduce chances of tear out. Well, I knew this one was going to be difficult from the start because it's effectively two projects in one. On the one hand, I've got a table to make, and on the other hand, I've got a painting to do. And I didn't even know what that painting was going to be in the beginning. I mean, I knew I wanted it to be space themed, you know, beat the Russians to the moon. It had to match the mid-century modern aesthetic. But I had trouble finding something that didn't look out of place painted on the side of a coffee table. I can't even tell you how many drawings I did. Eventually, I just hit a brick wall, and for better or worse, I had to bring in somebody with a fresh set of eyes to take a look and give me some feedback. Yeah, I don't know. Something's missing. Something is missing. I don't know. Maybe, look at this. What do you think? You didn't even look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did look at it, or yeah, you didn't look at it?
Watch this.
It's the one where he farts and wakes himself up.
Hey, when he sniffed his butt?
Yep. That's what he did.
So cute.
Now that I've got some solid feedback on the art, I got to get the top of this table finished. It needed to be done first because this process is going to be a little weird. I'm not exactly sure what type of paint or what type of finish I can use on the top of the table, but I'm going to be painting the top of this thing at the same time as I'm working on the base and the rest of the table. So this walnut I had grain going in every direction, and I was getting a lot of tear out when I'd send it through the planer. It got even worse when I started trying to flush trim it. So the second time around, I got out the hand plane and got it as close as possible. And now I can go back through with the router and flush it up to the table. All right, the top of the table's done for now. The bottom of the table is going to go through a different process, so I'm going to stop here and take the top of the table to the laser, and then I'll finish up with the bottom of the table later. The bottom half, minus the legs. The bottom half of this table is going to be a tricky glue up. Since it's only a 1/2 inch thick plywood and the corners need to be rounded, dowels aren't going to be the best solution here. It is meant to be a lightweight table and not need to carry much weight, so I'm going to use glue. You can get a good bond with the side of plywood. Just remember to put down a coat of glue and let it seep in and dry. Once the glue is dry, it should bond well with other things. The idea for the edges of the table being rounded over was sort of a late addition. After putting all the parts together, I decided I didn't like all the sharp angles. In order to have enough room to do the roundovers, I'm going to need to extend the banding on the sides. I'm using the router to preemptively cut the rounded inside of the banding. I'll cut the outside later. And it's right about now that I'm realizing that the extensions that I'm making so that I can round over the edges of the table are going to be the only sections of end grain on the front of the table. So my solution? More edge banding. This time around I'm going to make the edge banding so that I can miter the corners and it should give a lot cleaner look. The problem is this thing's only a 1/2 inch thick on the shelf side, and I still need to install this hardware so that I can attach the legs. And that's not a lot of room to play with. One of the issues with working with 1/2 inch thick plywood is there's not a lot of depth to add hardware. I'm making spacers to attach to the bottom of the table that will match the legs. This should give me the needed depth to add the hardware so that I can attach the legs. Alright, this is the tricky part. You can see what I mean. I had to cut out a wooden block to hold up the higher side of the table. It was the only way I was going to be able to get enough clamping pressure. Here I'm working on the spacer for the top of the table. You'll notice that I start out using plywood. About halfway through I had to change over to oak. The plywood just wasn't keeping a sharp enough edge in the corners. I'm staining the spacer black. This will keep any spots missing gold leaf from being too obvious. I'm using plywood templates to cut out the legs. I wouldn't normally do it this way, but I didn't have any MDF around. MDF has a more consistent surface. When using plywood templates with a flush trim bit, the inconsistencies in the plies of wood can sometimes lead to a bad cut. For trickier pieces like this, where I tend to get some tear out, what I'll do is pull my fence forward on my router table, and it allows me to use it almost like a planer. The bearing is there to keep me from going too deep or too far into the cut, but I'm using the fence as a way to do shallow passes, which greatly reduces the chance of tear out. The shape of the table reminds me of the lunar lander from the Apollo missions, or even some cheesy spaceship from an old science fiction B movie. So I decided I wanted to push that idea a little bit further. On all these planetary landers, the legs usually have this negative space in them formed by the different bars and pipes and stuff that hold the ship up. And so to mimic that form, I wanted to add some negative space to the legs of the table. Sanded, image burned. Now the scary part, I want to gold leaf it. I've never gold leafed anything before. So I made a stencil to reduce the chances I'm going to screw anything up. I'm going to take the stencil, line it up as best I can with the image, take the spray adhesive, remove the stencil carefully, take the gold leaf, and I don't really get into it much in the video, but the spray adhesive was not a good idea. One problem was it blew the template up and got spray adhesive underneath it, which didn't work well. And the other problem was it just seemed to clump up the gold leaf. Not to mention that any of that adhesive that gets on your table is a pain in the butt to sand off later, especially when you've got such a thin sheet of walnut plywood before you get through to the MDF below. I end up using actual gilding glue. This worked far better. You can put it on, let it sit for 30 minutes to an hour, and it dries into this tacky film. Then you just lay the gold leaf over it and brush away the excess. This ended up working out much better. During the design process for the table, I saw the opportunity to add gold leafing to the spacer that's on the right side of the table. Once I drilled out the holes in the legs, drawing inspiration from the lunar lander, it made sense to incorporate the gold leafing into the legs as well. I really like the motif of the gold leaf running throughout the table. When you look at the lunar lander, it's covered in foil, both silver and gold. So this is just one more of those design aesthetics inspired by the landing craft. It's time to paint. I added a coat of polyurethane over the top of the table to protect the gold leaf. Now I'm using oil paint on top of the polyurethane. You can paint oil on top of acrylic, but you can't paint acrylic on top of oil. It took a couple of layers, but I finally built up enough color so that you couldn't see through to the wood. It'll take these oils at least 3 days to dry, and then I'll have to go back over the top of this with more polyurethane to protect the paint. All right, the finishing touches. This part was legit nerve-wracking. Some of this stuff was just easier to do towards the end, and other things just sort of slipped through the cracks until we got to this point. But doing all the roundovers on the top part of the table, once the top of the table has already been fastened to the bottom part of the table and painted, well, I would have probably talked a few octaves higher than normal during this. Despite all my best efforts to avoid chip out, I did get little bits here and there. Fortunately, I was able to repair them with some wood glue and some sawdust or some wood chippings. As part of this process, I used Otis oil to finish the table because I wanted the dark, rich look of walnut. But since the top had to be painted, I also had to cover it in polyurethane to protect the paint. This meant for the table to look consistent throughout, I needed to cover the entire table with the polyurethane as well. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Thanks for sticking around. This is my entry into the Rockler Try That Challenge. It's a competition Rockler's putting on for people to try things that they've always wanted to, but maybe never gotten around to for whatever reason. And I've always wanted to do woodworking. I've actually always had this idea for a coffee table that looks sort of like a moonlander, and I could do a cool illustration on it of a cosmonaut. So this is my first piece of furniture. I mean, sure, I've done the odd 2x4 shop piece and stuff like that, but nothing that was finished that would go in a home. And I've also always wanted to make a YouTube video about it. So, 3 birds, 1 stone. Anyway, I figured it'd be nice for you to see it in its natural habitat, so stick around for the glamour shots, and I'll have another video coming out at the end of next month. So, I hope to see you back again.
Squishing